The rusted hull of the USS Meridian groaned against the Arctic winds, its skeleton buried under 3 feet of fresh snow in the remote Alaskan wasteland. Sarah Chen pressed her bleeding shoulder against the frozen bulkhead, her 2 children huddled behind her as hypothermia crept through their soaked clothes. The helicopter crash had left them stranded with no rescue in sight, and this ghost ship was their only chance at survival. But Sarah wasn't just a desperate mother fleeing her ex-husband's violent threats. 10 years ago, she'd been Lieutenant Chen, the Navy's top cryptographer, and she recognized the serial numbers etched into the vault door they'd stumbled upon. This wasn't just any abandoned cargo. It was Operation Blackwater's missing payload, $270 million in untraceable bearer bonds that disappeared during a classified mission gone wrong. As her children's lips turned blue and distant rotors echoed through the storm, Sarah realized their hunters had found them. The question wasn't whether they'd survive the cold anymore, it was whether the very people who'd hidden this fortune would let them live to tell about it. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Commander Hayes briefing her team in that windowless Pentagon room, his weathered face grave as he'd explained Operation Blackwater's objectives. The bonds were meant to fund a deep-cover asset in Eastern Europe, but the transport vessel had vanished somewhere in the Bering Sea. The official report blamed equipment failure and rough seas. Sarah had suspected otherwise, even then. "Mom, I can't feel my feet," whispered Emma, her 8-year-old daughter, teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. "I know, baby. We're going to get warm soon." Sarah pulled both children closer, feeling the violent shivering of her 12-year-old son Marcus against her ribs. The crash had torn a gash across her shoulder blade, where twisted metal had caught her during their desperate escape from the burning wreckage. But that pain was nothing compared to watching her children suffer. The helicopter rotors grew louder, circling like mechanical vultures. Through a gap in the ship's hull, she glimpsed searchlights cutting through the swirling snow. These weren't Coast Guard rescue teams. They'd arrived too quickly, too precisely. Marcus had been right when he'd spotted the dark sedan following them from the courthouse in Anchorage. Her ex-husband's threats about taking the children had been more than empty rage. Sarah's fingers traced the vault's combination lock, muscle memory from her Navy days automatically calculating the standard encryption protocols. The Meridian's cargo hold reeked of rust and diesel fuel, but it was marginally warmer than the exposed deck above. If she could get the vault open, the enclosed space might provide better shelter. "What is this place?" Marcus asked, pressing his face against her jacket. Even through their terror, her son's curiosity remained intact. "An old Navy ship, sweetheart. It got stuck in the ice a long time ago." She didn't mention that according to official records, the USS Meridian had been decommissioned and scrapped 15 years ago. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make this vessel disappear from all databases. The first tumbler clicked into place. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Commander Hayes' voice explaining the secondary protocols. He'd been nervous during that briefing, constantly checking his watch, refusing to meet her eyes when she'd asked about extraction procedures. Now she understood why. A second click. The wind outside intensified, howling through the ship's broken superstructure like tortured souls. The searchlights swept closer, their beams occasionally penetrating the cargo hold through rust holes and missing plates. "Mom, are those people going to hurt us?" Emma's voice was barely audible. Sarah's jaw tightened. 2 years of restraining orders, police reports, and legal battles had taught her that some people couldn't be reasoned with or escaped from through proper channels. Her ex-husband's connections in military contracting had made him untouchable, but she'd finally gathered enough evidence to threaten his empire. That's why they'd been flying to meet the federal prosecutor in Fairbanks, when the helicopter's engine had mysteriously failed. The third tumbler aligned. The vault door's massive hinges protested as she pulled it open, revealing stacks of weatherproof cases arranged with military precision. Even in the dim light filtering through the hull, she could see the distinctive Treasury Department seals on each container. The helicopter landed somewhere above them, its rotors winding down to an ominous silence. Boots crunched through snow, multiple sets moving with tactical coordination across the ship's deck. Radio chatter echoed through the metal corridors, too distant to understand but close enough to recognize the urgency in their voices. Sarah gathered her children and pushed them into the vault's interior, then sealed them inside the cramped but insulated space. In the darkness, surrounded by enough money to fund a small war, she held her babies close and tried to formulate a plan that didn't end with their bodies disappearing into the Arctic wilderness. Outside, the hunters had arrived, and they wanted their treasure back. The children's chattering teeth echoed through the cavernous mess hall as Sarah worked to get a fire started in what had once been a galley. The abandoned warship groaned around them, metal contracting in the savage cold that had driven them aboard 3 hours ago. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault on Lake Superior, turning their planned camping trip into a fight for survival. "Mom, this place is creepy," whispered 10-year-old Emma, huddling closer to her younger brother Jake. The boy hadn't spoken since they'd climbed through the rusted hull breach, his wide eyes taking in the ghostly remains of what Sarah recognized as a decommissioned destroyer. "It's just old, sweetheart," Sarah replied, though her own nerves were on edge. Something felt wrong about this place beyond the obvious decay. Her cryptographer's mind, trained by 8 years in naval intelligence, automatically catalogued inconsistencies. The ship was too clean in places, too organized for something supposedly abandoned for decades. She got the makeshift fire going using debris and emergency matches from their camping supplies. The flames cast dancing shadows on bulkheads that should have been stripped bare during decommissioning, but instead displayed intact instrumentation and secured hatches marked with warnings she remembered from her service days. "Can we explore?" Jake finally spoke, his natural curiosity overcoming fear as warmth began to fill the space. "Absolutely not. We stay together until the storm passes." Sarah's tone brooked no argument, but her own eyes were already mapping the ship's layout. The bridge would be up 2 levels, communications probably still 1 deck below that. Old habits died hard. A distant metallic clang made them all freeze. "Just the wind," Sarah said quickly, but her hand instinctively moved to the tactical knife on her belt. The sound had been too regular, too purposeful. Someone or something else was on this ship. Emma pressed closer to her mother. "I don't like it here." Another clang, followed by what sounded like footsteps on metal decking. Sarah's pulse quickened as her military training kicked in. She grabbed the flashlight and motioned for the children to stay behind her. "Listen carefully," she whispered. "If I tell you to run, you go back the way we came and hide in those life rafts we passed. Don't come looking for me, no matter what you hear." The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by voices, at least 2 men speaking in what sounded like Russian. Sarah's blood ran cold. Russian operatives on an abandoned American warship in the middle of a blizzard wasn't coincidence. She guided her children deeper into the shadows as the voices grew louder. Through a partially open hatch, she watched 2 figures in military-grade cold weather gear move through the corridor with tactical flashlights and automatic weapons. These weren't sailors or Coast Guard. They moved with the precision of special forces. "Dolgen bites ZD's GD2, one said. Something about must be here somewhere. Sarah's Russian was rusty but functional. They were searching for something specific. The question was what, and whether her family had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple shelter. The men passed their hiding spot and continued aft. Sarah waited several minutes before emerging from the shadows, her mind racing through possibilities. Why would Russian operatives be on this ship? What were they looking for? And more importantly, how was she going to get her children off this floating tomb? "Mom?" Emma's voice was barely audible. "Shh!" Sarah was thinking furiously. The storm would last at least until dawn, trapping them here with armed hostiles. Their small boat was beached and useless until the weather cleared. That left only one option. She needed to find out what was so valuable on this ship that it warranted this kind of attention. Her cryptographer instincts were screaming that this wasn't random. Ships weren't just abandoned with their electronics intact. Communications equipment wasn't left functional unless someone wanted it functional. This was either a trap or a treasure, and either way, knowledge was survival. "We're going to play a very quiet game," she told her children, keeping her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're going to explore this ship, but we're going to be invisible, like ninjas." Jake's eyes lit up despite his fear. Real ninjas? The best kind. The ones nobody ever sees coming. Sarah checked her watch, 0347 hours. Dawn was still hours away, but she'd learned long ago that waiting for rescue was often a luxury she couldn't afford. She gathered their supplies and led them deeper into the ship, away from where the voices had disappeared. If this vessel held secrets worth killing for, she intended to find them first. Her children's lives might depend on understanding exactly what game they'd stumbled into. The destroyer's corridors stretched ahead like a maze of shadows and steel, holding answers that Sarah Chen was uniquely qualified to uncover. The scared mother was rapidly giving way to the intelligence officer she'd once been, and that officer had never failed a mission. The children's faces glowed pale in the flashlight beam as Sarah examined the encrypted drive more closely. The device was warm to the touch, recently used, and bore markings she recognized from her Navy days. This wasn't some forgotten relic from the ship's decommissioning. "Mom, what is it?" Emma whispered, pressing closer. "Just some old equipment, sweetheart." Sarah slipped the drive into her jacket pocket, her mind racing. Someone had been here recently, and they'd left behind something valuable enough to encrypt with military-grade security. A sharp crack echoed through the ship's hull, and they all froze. Sarah's heart hammered as she distinguished the sound from the storm's fury, metal on metal, deliberate and rhythmic. Footsteps on the deck above. She clicked off the flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Nobody move," she breathed, barely audible above the wind howling through the ship's superstructure. More footsteps, at least 2 sets, moving with purpose across the deck. Voices carried down through the ventilation system, harsh, urgent, speaking in rapid Russian. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She understood enough to catch fragments: package, American woman, children. They weren't here by coincidence. She felt for Emma and Jake in the darkness, pulling them closer. Her daughter's breathing was shallow with fear, while Jake trembled against her side. The narrow compartment that had seemed like salvation now felt like a trap. The footsteps moved toward the hatch they'd used to enter. Sarah cursed silently. Their tracks in the snow would be clearly visible despite the storm. She'd been focused on finding shelter, not covering their trail. A beam of light stabbed down through the hatch, sweeping the corridor outside their hiding spot. Sarah pressed the children against the far wall, hoping the shadows would conceal them. The encrypted drive felt like it was burning a hole through her jacket. Spread out came a voice in accented English. "They're here somewhere." Sarah's mind worked frantically, drawing on training she'd hoped never to use again. The ship's layout was burned into her memory from the technical manual she'd studied during her service. There were 3 ways off this deck: the main hatch they'd used, an emergency escape route through the engine room, and a maintenance shaft that led to the torpedo tubes. The footsteps split up, one set heading toward their hiding spot, while another moved deeper into the ship. Sarah made her decision. She found Emma's ear in the darkness. "When I say run, go straight down the corridor to your left. Count 20 steps, then feel for a ladder going down. Don't wait for me." "I'm not leaving you," Emma whispered back. "You're protecting your brother. That's an order." Light flickered closer to their compartment. Sarah gripped the heavy wrench she'd noticed earlier, its weight familiar and reassuring. She'd hoped those days were behind her, but desperation had a way of resurrecting old skills. The searcher reached their corridor, his flashlight beam sweeping methodically. Sarah could see the outline of his weapon, definitely military grade. These weren't common thieves or smugglers. She waited until he passed their hiding spot, then moved silently behind him. The wrench caught him at the base of the skull with a wet thud, and he dropped without a sound. Sarah caught his falling flashlight and weapon, muscle memory guiding her hands. "Now," she hissed to the children. They ran through the darkness, following the flashlight beam Sarah kept low and focused. Behind them, shouts erupted as the second man discovered his partner. Sarah herded Emma and Jake toward the engine room, her mind calculating distances and escape routes. The maintenance shaft was exactly where she remembered, a narrow opening barely wide enough for an adult. She boosted Jake up first, then Emma, before squeezing through herself just as their pursuer's light swept the engine room. The shaft was a claustrophobic nightmare of rust and ice, but it led toward the ship's bow and another way out. Sarah could hear their pursuer trying to follow, but his bulk wouldn't fit through the opening. He was shouting into a radio now, calling for backup. They emerged into the forward torpedo room, where circular loading doors offered access to the outer hull. Sarah worked frantically at the manual release, her fingers numb with cold despite her gloves. The mechanism was frozen, corroded by decades of neglect. Behind them, explosions of sound indicated their pursuers were blasting through bulkhead doors rather than following the shaft. Sarah estimated they had minutes at most. The release finally gave way with a grinding shriek of metal. Arctic wind and snow blasted through the opening as the outer door cracked open. Beyond lay the storm-lashed deck and a treacherous climb down to the ice. Sarah looked at her children's frightened faces, knowing she was about to ask them to risk everything on the slim chance they could disappear into the blizzard. The alternative was facing whoever wanted that drive badly enough to hunt them through a storm. The decision was no choice at all. The emergency radio crackled to life at 0347 hours, jolting Sarah from her restless watch by the porthole. She'd been tracking the storm's progress, noting how the wind patterns had shifted in the last hour. The blizzard was weakening, but not fast enough. Coast Guard station anchorage to any vessels in the Resurrection Bay area. Be advised, multiple aircraft have been detected flying in zero visibility conditions. Repeat, unauthorized aircraft operating in hazardous weather. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She killed the radio's volume and listened to the ship's hull groaning around them. Through the howling wind outside, something else caught her attention, a rhythmic thumping that definitely wasn't natural. Helicopters. She moved swiftly to where Emma and Jake slept, their small forms bundled in the navy blankets she'd found in the supply locker. Emma stirred as Sarah's hand touched her shoulder. "Mom?" Emma's voice was thick with sleep. "We need to move, now. Stay quiet and follow me exactly." Jake's eyes snapped open with the alertness of a child who'd learned to read danger in his mother's tone. "What's wrong? Remember the game we used to play? Navy SEALs?" Sarah was already gathering their essential supplies, her movements efficient and silent. "This is the real version." The helicopter sound was growing louder, and Sarah's mind raced through tactical possibilities. The storm provided cover, but it also trapped them. The ship's metal hull would show up on thermal imaging like a beacon, and their body heat would be visible the moment the aircraft got close enough. "Mom, you're scaring me," Emma whispered. Sarah knelt between her children, her hands steady on their shoulders, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Remember what I told you about my job in the Navy? Sometimes I had to solve puzzles that other people didn't want solved. Well, I think I accidentally solved one today." She gestured toward the sealed container in the corner. In her earlier examination, she'd managed to partially decode the shipping manifests. What she'd found made her stomach drop. Financial routing codes for offshore accounts, transaction records that suggested money laundering on a massive scale, and most damning of all, a list of names that included 3 sitting federal judges and a deputy attorney general. "Someone lost something very valuable," she continued, "and they're looking for it." Jake, ever practical, asked, "Can't we just give it back?" Sarah's laugh was grim. "Sweetie, these aren't the kind of people you return lost property to. They're the kind who make sure witnesses disappear." The helicopter noise crescendoed directly overhead, then began to circle. Through the storm, Sarah could make out searchlight beams cutting through the snow, methodical and precise. Professional. She led her children deeper into the ship's interior, away from the outer compartments where their heat signatures might be detected. Her knowledge of naval architecture served them well. She navigated toward the engine room, where the residual heat from the ship's long cold systems would mask their thermal footprints. "This is like a movie," Jake whispered, and Sarah caught the excitement underlying his fear. "Movies have happy endings guaranteed," she murmured back. "Real life requires better planning." They descended 2 levels via a maintenance ladder, Sarah's flashlight creating dancing shadows on the corroded walls. The air grew colder and more stale, but the helicopter sounds became more distant. She found what she was looking for, a secondary communications array that might still have power. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't make noise. If something happens to me—" "Mom, no!" Emma grabbed her arm. "If something happens," Sarah continued firmly, "wait until morning. The storm will pass, and then you signal the Coast Guard. Tell them everything. Show them what we found. Don't trust anyone else, understand?" She worked quickly on the communication panel, her fingers remembering procedures from years past. The equipment was older than her Navy service, but the principles remained the same. After several minutes of rewiring, a green light flickered to life. Sarah began transmitting on an encrypted military frequency she prayed someone would monitor. Any station, any station. This is cryptographer Chen, service number 779 Delta Delta. I have priority intelligence regarding operation. The transmission cut off as the ship's emergency power died completely, but it might have been enough. Someone in the military intelligence community might have heard, might remember her clearance level, might send help. The helicopter sounds were moving away, but Sarah knew they'd return. Weather was temporary, determination wasn't. She rejoined her children in the darkness, wrapping them close. "Now we wait." "For the Coast Guard?" Emma asked hopefully. Sarah stared into the blackness, calculating odds and contingencies. "For whoever gets here first." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the abandoned warship, but inside, Sarah Chen began planning like the military strategist she'd once been. Some puzzles, once started, demanded completion, regardless of the cost. The storm had intensified during the night, and Sarah woke to the sound of metal groaning under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. The emergency lantern cast dancing shadows across the cramped compartment where they'd made their temporary shelter. Emma was still asleep, curled against her side, but Jake sat awake in the corner, his young face etched with worry. "Mom, what if we can't get out?" he whispered, not wanting to wake his sister. Sarah checked her watch. 630 hours. Old habits died hard. "We will. But first, I need to take another look at what we found yesterday." She'd spent most of the night thinking about those sealed containers and the sophisticated equipment they'd discovered. The ship's designation, hull modifications, and the presence of encrypted communication gear suggested this wasn't just any decommissioned vessel. This was a Black Ops transport, and whatever cargo it carried had been important enough to risk everything. "Stay here with Emma. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Jake nodded, understanding the gravity in his mother's voice. Sarah grabbed the lantern and made her way back through the ship's corridors, noting details she'd missed in yesterday's frantic search for shelter. Stenciled warnings in multiple languages lined the bulkheads, environmental hazard symbols, and, most telling of all, Cyrillic script alongside English text. The cargo hold was exactly as they'd left it, but in the lantern's steady light, Sarah could see markings on the containers she'd missed before, serial numbers that followed a pattern she recognized from her Navy days. These weren't just any containers. They were part of a classified transport system used for moving high-value assets across international borders. She approached the opened container again, studying the internal structure. The foam padding was custom-molded, designed to protect something specific. But the real revelation came when she noticed a small panel near the container's base. Her fingers traced the edges until she found the hidden latch. The panel opened to reveal a compact digital display and keypad, still functional after all these years, powered by an internal battery system that defied belief. The screen showed a single line of text: authentication required. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was military-grade encryption, the kind of system she'd worked with during her years in naval intelligence. She still remembered the override protocols, the backdoor codes that existed for emergency situations. Her fingers moved across the keypad with practiced precision, entering a sequence she'd hoped never to use again. The screen flickered, then displayed a new message: emergency access granted. What followed was a cascade of information that made Sarah's blood run cold: shipping manifests, financial records, and most damning of all, a detailed inventory of what had been transported on this vessel's final voyage. The containers hadn't held weapons or drugs as she'd initially suspected. They'd contained something far more valuable and dangerous: financial instruments worth hundreds of millions of dollars, bearer bonds, cryptocurrency access codes, and offshore account information that could topple governments. But the real shock came in the final entry: operation terminated, crew expendable, recovery priority alpha. Sarah understood now why this ship had been abandoned in these remote waters. It wasn't an accident or mechanical failure. The crew had discovered what they were really transporting and had tried to disappear with the cargo. They'd almost succeeded. A sound from the upper deck froze her in place, not the wind or settling ice, something mechanical, an engine, still distant but growing closer. Sarah killed the lantern immediately and strained to listen. The sound was definitely getting louder, and it wasn't the Coast Guard. Military helicopters had a distinctive rotor signature, and this was civilian. Fast boats with high-powered engines designed for Arctic conditions. She'd found the treasure, but the treasure had found her family. Moving quickly in the darkness, Sarah committed the most crucial information to memory before closing the panel. Account numbers, access codes, shipping routes, details that would either save their lives or get them killed, depending on how she played this. The people coming for this cargo had already proven they'd kill to protect their secrets. Sarah made her way back through the ship's corridors with practiced stealth, her mind racing through possibilities. They couldn't run, the storm made escape impossible. They couldn't hide, thermal imaging would find them within minutes. That left only one option: negotiation from a position of strength. By the time she reached the compartment where her children waited, the sound of approaching engines was unmistakable. Jake was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom, what's that noise?" Sarah pulled both children close, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Listen to me very carefully. Some people are coming and they're looking for something on this ship. We're going to be smart about this and we're all going home safe. But I need you both to trust me completely." Emma stirred in her arms. "Are they bad people?" Sarah met her daughter's innocent gaze, knowing that the next few hours would test every skill she'd learned in her previous life. "Some of them might be, but your mom knows how to handle bad people." The engines were very close now. The encrypted files painted a picture that made Sarah's blood run cold. Sitting cross-legged on the steel deck while her children slept, she'd spent the last 2 hours deciphering the documents from Kozlov's safe. Her old Navy training had come flooding back: pattern recognition, cipher analysis, the methodical patience required to crack military-grade encryption. What she'd uncovered was a detailed manifest of something called Operation Blackwater. The warship they'd taken shelter in wasn't just any abandoned vessel. According to the files, it was the former USS Meridian, decommissioned 5 years ago and sold to a private military contractor. But instead of being properly scrapped, it had been retrofitted for a very different purpose. The cryptocurrency storage was just the beginning. The ship had been converted into a floating safehouse for various criminal enterprises: money laundering, arms dealing, and human trafficking. The coordinates in the files showed regular stops at ports across the Baltic, Mediterranean, and North Sea. Each location corresponded to transaction records worth millions. Sarah's hands trembled as she read about the human cargo manifests. Children, young women. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what she was looking at. Her gaze drifted to Emma and Jake, bundled together under emergency blankets, and her jaw tightened. A sound from somewhere deep in the ship made her freeze. Metal against metal, deliberate and rhythmic. Footsteps. She quickly powered down the tablet and slipped it into her jacket, then grabbed the pistol she'd taken from Kozlov's body. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing through the maze of corridors below. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. Sarah crept where her children lay sleeping and gently shook Emma awake. Her daughter's eyes opened immediately, alert despite the early hour. "We need to move," Sarah whispered. "Now. Wake your brother, but keep him quiet." Emma nodded, understanding the gravity in her mother's voice. She carefully roused Jake, placing a finger to his lips before he could speak. The boy's eyes went wide, but he remained silent. The footsteps were on their deck now. Sarah counted at least 3 distinct patterns, spread out in what sounded like a search formation. These weren't random scavengers or Coast Guard personnel. They moved too deliberately, too professionally. She led her children toward the rear of the bridge, away from the main entrance. There had to be another way out. Ships this size always had multiple access points for emergency situations. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness as she scanned the walls, finding what she was looking for: a maintenance hatch leading to the ship's superstructure. The hatch was stiff with rust and salt corrosion, but Sarah managed to force it open without making too much noise. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of the sea and the promise of dawn on the horizon. The storm had finally begun to subside, though snow still fell steadily. "Where are we going, Mom?" Jake whispered, as Sarah helped him through the hatch onto a narrow external walkway. "Away from the bad men," she replied, lifting Emma through next. The walkway was slick with ice, and the wind cut through their clothes like knives, but it was better than being trapped inside with whoever was hunting them. Behind them, she heard voices in the bridge, Russian accents speaking in urgent, clipped tones. They'd discovered Kozlov's body. Sarah heard her name mentioned along with words she recognized: children, files, and eliminate. The walkway led to a series of external ladders that ran along the ship's hull. Sarah had climbed similar structures during her Navy training, but never while protecting 2 children in a blizzard. Each step was treacherous, and the metal rungs burned their hands even through gloves. They descended slowly, Jake between Sarah and Emma for safety. The water below looked black and unforgiving, chunks of ice floating like broken glass. But the ship's hull provided some protection from the wind, and Sarah could see lights in the distance, the Norwegian coast. There she pointed toward a partially enclosed lifeboat station about 20 feet below them. "We can hide there and figure out our next move." As they climbed down, Sarah's mind raced through their options. The encrypted files on the tablet contained enough evidence to bring down a major criminal network, but only if they survived long enough to deliver it to the right authorities. The problem was figuring out who they could trust. Operation Blackwater clearly had connections that reached into government and military circles. The lifeboat station was a partially enclosed platform designed to house emergency evacuation craft. Most of the boats were missing, but the structure provided shelter from both the weather and searching eyes. Sarah helped her children inside and immediately began checking the remaining equipment for anything useful. Above them, flashlight beams swept the ship's superstructure. Their pursuers had realized they'd escaped the bridge and were expanding the search. It wouldn't be long before someone thought to check the external areas of the ship. Sarah found what she was looking for: a functional emergency radio and flare gun, but using either would reveal their location to friend and foe alike. The radio crackled to life at 0600, jolting Sarah from her restless sleep. She'd been dozing against the bulkhead, one ear always listening for sounds that didn't belong to the storm. The voice that emerged from the static made her blood freeze. "Base, this is Falcon 1. Weather's clearing faster than predicted. We'll have visual on the target location within the hour." Sarah grabbed the radio, switching frequencies rapidly. 3 different channels carried similar transmissions, coordinated search teams closing in from multiple directions. Her hands moved automatically through frequency sweeps, muscle memory from countless nights monitoring enemy communications in the Navy. "Mom?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper from across the compartment. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just checking the weather." The lie came easily, but Sarah's mind was racing. The blizzard that had been their shield was lifting, and whoever was hunting them had resources she hadn't anticipated. She moved quietly to the porthole, wiping away condensation with her sleeve. Dawn was breaking through thinning clouds, and she could see farther across the frozen harbor than she had since they'd arrived. In the distance, barely visible against the white landscape, something moved. Vehicles, multiple vehicles approaching from the main road. Tommy stirred in his sleeping bag, mumbling about being hungry. Sarah's chest tightened. They needed to move, but where could they go? The ship was surrounded by open ice field for hundreds of yards in every direction. They'd be visible the moment they stepped outside. She returned to the radio, fine-tuning the frequency until the voices became crystal clear. Russian accents mixed with American ones, a joint operation. Her throat constricted as she recognized the systematic precision of their communications. These weren't common criminals or even typical organized crime. This was military or intelligence-level coordination. Thermal imaging shows heat signatures in the forward section. Came a new voice. 3 sources, possibly 4. Sarah's training kicked in. She switched off the radio and moved swiftly through the compartment, gathering their scattered belongings. They had minutes at most before the search teams reached the ship. "Emma, Tommy, wake up now. We need to move." "But it's cold," Tommy protested, still half asleep. "I know, buddy, but we're playing a new game. Remember hide and seek? We need to find the best hiding spot on the whole ship." Emma sat up, instantly alert. She'd inherited Sarah's ability to read danger in adult voices. "Are the bad people coming?" Sarah nodded, pulling on Tommy's boots while he rubbed his eyes. "The ones I told you about, but we're going to stay ahead of them." She'd spent hours the previous day exploring the ship's layout, her cryptographer's mind automatically mapping potential escape routes. There was a passage that led from their current section down to the engine room, then through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the aft compartments. If they could reach the stern, they might be able to slip over the side and use the ship's hull as cover. The sound of engines grew louder outside. Sarah peered through the porthole again and counted at least 6 vehicles, including what looked like military-grade snowmobiles. Her stomach dropped as she spotted the distinctive outline of a helicopter on the horizon. "Listen carefully," she whispered, kneeling between her children. "We're going deeper into the ship. It's going to be dark and scary, but I need you both to be brave. Tommy, you hold on to Emma's hand. Emma, you follow right behind me. No talking, no matter what we hear." She shouldered the backpack, containing the most critical items, emergency food, first aid supplies, and the encrypted drive she'd hidden inside a waterproof pouch. The bearer bonds would have to stay hidden in their original location. If she was right about what they represented, removing them would only make recovery easier for the people hunting them. The first footsteps echoed from somewhere above as Sarah led her children toward the passage she'd identified. The metal deck plates rang softly under boots, professional movement, but not silent. They were confident, systematic, a search pattern that would sweep from bow to stern, compartment by compartment. Sarah guided Emma and Tommy through a hatch barely wide enough for an adult. The passage beyond was pitch black, filled with the smell of rust and stagnant water. She used her phone's flashlight sparingly, just enough to navigate the treacherous footing. Behind them, voices carried through the ship's structure. Commands shouted in English and Russian, the systematic opening and closing of hatches. They were thorough, checking every possible hiding place. The passage sloped downward, taking them deeper into the ship's belly. Sarah's lungs burned with the effort of moving quietly while carrying Tommy when he stumbled. Emma pressed close behind her, trembling but silent. They reached a junction where the passage branched in 3 directions. Sarah paused, listening. The sounds of the search were growing closer, echoing through the ship's steel skeleton. She had to choose deeper into the maze of passages or try to reach the exterior where they might escape but would be exposed. The decision could mean the difference between survival and capture. The sound of approaching engines cut through the howling wind like a blade. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she peered through the warship's porthole, watching 3 black SUVs carve paths through the snow toward their position. Even through the blizzard, she could make out the coordinated movement of armed figures emerging from the vehicles. "Kids, grab your gear, now." Her voice remained steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "We're leaving." Emma looked up from where she'd been helping Jake organize the cash bundles. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Company." Sarah was already moving, stuffing essential supplies into their backpacks, the kind that shoots first and asks questions later. Jake's face went pale. "How did they find us?" Sarah cursed herself silently. She should have anticipated this. The storm might have covered their tracks, but it wouldn't hide the warship's hull signature from anyone with the right equipment. These people had resources, military-grade resources. "There's got to be another way out," she muttered, running through the ship's layout in her mind. The main gangway was compromised, but old warships were built with multiple escape routes. A sharp crack echoed through the hull, someone testing the ice around the ship's perimeter. They were being systematic, professional, not random thugs, but trained operatives. Sarah grabbed Jake's shoulder. "Remember what I told you about the engine room? There's an emergency hatch near the stern that leads to the lower deck. From there, we can reach the torpedo loading bay." "But that's underwater," Emma protested. "Not completely. These old ships sit low, but there's still clearance." Sarah hoped she was right. It had been years since her naval architecture training, but desperation sharpened her memory. "We'll have to wade through some icy water, but it beats the alternative." The sound of boots clanking on metal told her their pursuers had boarded, multiple sets of footsteps moving with military precision. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct patterns, probably more outside maintaining perimeter security. She shouldered her pack, heavy with cash and the encrypted documents. "Stay close, stay quiet, and do exactly what I say." They moved through the ship's bowels like ghosts, Sarah leading them down increasingly narrow passages. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, their breath visible in crystalline puffs. Behind them, she could hear voices, clipped, professional communication filtering down through the ship's ventilation system. "Target location secured. No immediate contact. Copy that. Beginning systematic sweep. They're here somewhere." Sarah's jaw tightened. They knew. Somehow, they'd confirmed that she and the kids were aboard. This wasn't a fishing expedition. It was a hunt. The emergency hatch was exactly where she remembered, though corroded and stubborn. Sarah braced her feet against the bulkhead and pulled, muscles straining against decades of neglect and ice. Finally, it groaned open, revealing a narrow passage that angled downward toward the ship's waterline. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of lake water and rust. The passage was barely wide enough for an adult, designed for emergency evacuation, not comfort. "I'll go first," Sarah whispered. "Emma, you're next, then Jake. If something happens to me, keep going until you reach the loading bay. There should be another exit that leads to the dock." "Mom," Emma started. "No arguments. This isn't negotiable." Sarah squeezed into the passage, immediately feeling the claustrophobic press of metal walls. The hatch angled sharply downward, forcing her to half-crawl, half-slide through the confined space. Behind her, she could hear Emma's controlled breathing and the rustle of movement. The passage opened into a larger chamber, the torpedo loading bay. Sarah's feet hit standing water that immediately soaked through her boots, the cold so intense it felt like knives. The water level reached mid-shin, but the chamber's ceiling remained well above the waterline. Emma emerged behind her with a sharp gasp at the cold, followed by Jake, who bit back a curse. In the dim emergency lighting, Sarah could see their destination, a loading hatch that should open directly onto the lake's edge. Above them, the sounds of search had intensified. Heavy footsteps moved systematically through the upper decks, getting closer to their original hiding spot. It would only be minutes before their pursuers found the emergency hatch. Sarah waded toward the loading hatch, each step sending ripples through the dark water. The manual release was stiff but functional. She cranked it slowly, trying to minimize noise while fighting the mechanism's resistance. The hatch cracked open, revealing a narrow slice of the outside world. Snow and wind immediately began filtering through, but Sarah could see their escape route, a maintenance ladder built into the ship's hull that led down to what had once been the dock level. "This is it," she whispered, then froze. Through the narrow opening, a red laser dot danced across the metal frame, inches from her head. Someone was waiting outside, watching this exact exit. They were trapped between the hunters above and the sniper below, with nowhere left to run. The blizzard's fury had subsided to intermittent gusts, but the real storm was brewing inside the warship's hull. Sarah's fingers flew across the tablet's cracked screen, her cryptographer instincts taking over as she decoded the final layers of protection surrounding the digital vault. Each breakthrough revealed another horrifying piece of the puzzle. What's wrong?" Emma's voice cut through her concentration. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah glanced up to find both children watching her with concern. The pale glow from the tablet cast eerie shadows across their faces, making them appear older than their years. She forced a smile, but knew it didn't reach her eyes. "Just complicated computer stuff, sweetheart. Why don't you and Jake explore a bit more? Stay within shouting distance." Emma's suspicious gaze lingered before she reluctantly took her brother's hand and wandered toward the far end of the compartment. Sarah waited until their footsteps faded before returning to the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The files painted a picture that made her blood run cold. Project Nightfall wasn't just about money laundering. It was a systematic operation to funnel weapons to terrorist cells across 3 continents. The digital ledger showed payments for everything from assault rifles to components for dirty bombs. Worse, the transactions bore the digital signatures of high-ranking military officials and government contractors. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized one name, Admiral Patricia Vance, her former commanding officer, the woman who had personally recruited Sarah into Navy intelligence, who had been like a mentor to her during those crucial early years. Seeing Vance's authorization codes attached to weapon shipments destined for known terror networks felt like a physical blow. A metallic clang echoed through the ship's hull, different from the wind-driven sounds they'd grown accustomed to. Sarah's head snapped up, her military training instantly alert. The noise came again, deliberate, rhythmic, footsteps on metal decking. "Emma, Jake," she called softly, her voice barely audible. "Come here. Now." "What is it?" Jake whispered. "Someone's on the ship." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by low voices. Sarah strained to make out words, but the wind and metal walls muffled everything into an indistinct murmur. What she could determine was that there were at least 2 people moving with purpose through the vessel. "This way," Sarah breathed, leading them deeper into the shadows of the compartment. She remembered seeing a maintenance hatch during their initial exploration, a narrow passage that might lead to other parts of the ship. They crept forward in darkness, Sarah's hands outstretched to feel their way along the bulkhead. Behind them, the voices grew clearer, male, professional, the kind of clipped, efficient communication she recognized from her military days. Thermal readings show 3 heat signatures, somewhere in the forward sections. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They had thermal imaging equipment. These weren't random scavengers or curious locals. This was a professional team, and they were hunting. Her fingers found the hatch wheel, cold and stiff with age. She put her full weight into turning it, praying the metal wouldn't shriek and give away their position. It moved grudgingly, each increment feeling like an eternity. "Mom," Emma whispered urgently, "there's a light." Sarah turned to see the faint glow of flashlights playing across the bulkhead where they'd been sitting moments before. The searchers had found their compartment. The hatch finally gave way, opening into a narrow maintenance tunnel barely wide enough for an adult. Sarah pushed Emma through first, then Jake, before squeezing in herself and carefully pulling the hatch closed behind them. The tunnel was pitch black and reeked of rust and stagnant water. Sarah felt along the walls, trying to orient herself within the ship's layout. If her memory of naval architecture was correct, this passage should connect to the engineering sections deeper in the vessel's belly. Behind them, she could hear the muffled sounds of their pursuers searching the compartment. A voice, clearer now through the metal walls, they were definitely here. Still warm. Another voice responded, "Check all the exits. They can't have gone far." Sarah urged the children forward through the cramped tunnel, their progress maddeningly slow. Jake's breathing was becoming labored, the confined space and stress triggering his anxiety. She reached forward to squeeze his shoulder reassuringly, feeling him steady under her touch. The tunnel curved downward, and Sarah felt a slight change in air pressure. They were descending into the ship's lower levels, further from their hunters, but also further from any escape route. She had to make a choice, hide and hope they'd give up, or find another way off the vessel entirely. The decision was made for her when voices echoed from behind them in the tunnel. Their pursuers had found the hatch. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt more threatening than the howling wind. Sarah crouched beside the porthole, watching the white expanse beyond while her mind raced through possibilities. The pristine snow outside looked deceptively peaceful, but she knew better. Volkov's men would come, and when they did, the abandoned destroyer would become a trap. "Mom, I'm scared," Emma whispered, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the weight of the encrypted drives in her jacket pocket. The intelligence they contained could topple governments, expose decades of corruption, and make her family targets for life. But it could also be their salvation if she played this right. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," she murmured, though her eyes never left the horizon. "But we need to be very quiet now." Jake sat hunched over the radio equipment they'd salvaged, his fingers working with surprising skill for a 10-year-old. He'd inherited her technical aptitude, and right now that might be the only thing keeping them alive. Sarah moved to his side, adjusting the antenna angle. Static crackled through the speakers, and then voices emerged, clipped, professional Russian. Her blood chilled as she recognized the coordination patterns. They weren't dealing with ordinary criminals anymore. How many vehicles? She translated automatically, then caught herself. The children didn't need to know the details. The radio fell silent, but the damage was done. Sarah's military training kicked in as she assessed their situation. The destroyer offered some advantages: multiple escape routes, defensible positions, and most importantly, the knowledge that their pursuers couldn't simply blow it up while the drives remained unfound. "Kids, we're going to play a game," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "Like hide and seek, but very important. Jake, remember the compartment where we found those blankets? I need you to take Emma there and wait for my signal." "But, Mom—" "No arguments. Take the emergency supplies and this." She pressed a flare gun into Jake's hands. "If anyone comes who isn't me, you fire this through the porthole. Understand?" Jake nodded gravely, understanding more than she wished he did. He took Emma's hand and led her toward the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the metal tomb. Sarah turned back to the radio, switching to a frequency she'd memorized years ago during her Navy service. If Commander Torres was still stationed at Norfolk, if he still monitored the old channels, if he remembered the codes they'd used for classified transmissions. "Look, 7, this is Knight Bishop," she transmitted, using their old chess-based call signs. "Package acquired, but the board is compromised. Request immediate extraction." Static answered her. She tried again, then switched frequencies. Minutes crawled by like hours until finally, impossibly, a familiar voice crackled through. "Knight Bishop, Rook 7. Confirm your position and package status." Relief flooded through her. Torres had always been reliable, even in the worst situations. But before she could respond, another sound cut through the destroyer, the distant rumble of engines. Sarah moved to the observation deck, staying low. 3 black SUVs carved tracks through the snow, approaching from the east, too coordinated to be rescue, too prepared to be anything but hostile. She counted at least 12 figures emerging from the vehicles, all armed, all moving with military precision. Back at the radio, she kept her voice steady. Rook 7, hostiles inbound. Package contains Blackwater protocols. Repeat, Blackwater protocols. Time critical. The pause on the other end told her Torres understood. Blackwater wasn't just any intelligence, it was the kind that could start wars or end them, the kind that made people disappear. Knight Bishop, maintain position. Cavalry en route, ETA 30 minutes. Keep the package secure. 30 minutes. Sarah looked toward the corridor where her children waited. The men outside would reach the destroyer in 5. She moved quickly through the ship, her memory mapping escape routes and choke points. The engine room offered the best defensive position, but it would also trap them. The upper decks provided mobility but little cover, and always the terrible knowledge that one mistake would leave Jake and Emma orphaned in this frozen wasteland. The first footsteps echoed on the hull above. Heavy boots, multiple sets, spreading out in a search pattern. These weren't amateurs. They knew exactly what they were looking for and how to find it. Sarah reached into her pocket and powered on one of the drives, watching as its indicator light began blinking. The encryption protocols she'd embedded years ago were still active, still protecting secrets that powerful people would kill to preserve or expose. The footsteps grew louder, more urgent. Someone barked orders in Russian. They'd found the entry point she'd used. Sarah took a deep breath and made her choice. She couldn't run, not with the children, not in this weather, not against these odds. But she could control the battlefield. After all, she'd spent 5 years learning every system on ships exactly like this one. The storm's howling masked the sound of approaching engines until Sarah's trained ear caught the mechanical whine cutting through the wind. She pressed herself against the porthole, peering through the ice-crusted glass into the white chaos beyond. 3 dark shapes materialized through the blizzard, snowmobiles moving in formation toward the ship's hull. "Maya, take your brother to the engine room," Sarah whispered, her voice deadly calm. "Remember the route I showed you. Lock the hatch from inside and don't come out until I give the all-clear signal." Maya's eyes widened, but she'd learned not to question that tone. She grabbed Tommy's hand and disappeared into the corridor's shadows. Sarah counted to 10, ensuring they had enough time to reach safety, then moved with practiced efficiency. Footsteps clanged against the ship's hull. They were boarding. Sarah killed the portable heater and plunged the compartment into Arctic darkness. Her breath formed crystalline clouds as she moved through the familiar layout, muscle memory from countless naval exercises guiding her steps. The abandoned warship's corridors became her battlefield, and she intended to use every advantage. The first intruder's voice echoed from the main deck, Russian accent, probably Volkov's advance team. Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized the professional terseness of trained killers discussing search patterns. They weren't here for negotiations. She positioned herself in the communications bay, where multiple exits provided tactical options. Through the bulkhead, she heard them splitting up, their movements coordinated but cautious. They knew she was former military. "Thermal shows 3 heat signatures," one voice reported through static, moving toward the lower decks. Sarah smiled grimly. The ship's metal hull would scatter their readings, especially with the engine room's residual heat throwing off their sensors. Her children were safer than the hunters realized, but that advantage wouldn't last long. The first man appeared at the corridor junction, assault rifle raised, night vision goggles scanning the darkness. Sarah waited until he passed her position, then struck. Her arm snaked around his throat, applying pressure to the carotid artery with surgical precision. He dropped unconsciously, and she caught his rifle before it clattered to the deck. "Dmitri, report." The radio crackled with increasing urgency. 2 down, at least 1 more to go. Sarah moved deeper into the ship's bowels, using her knowledge of the layout to stay ahead of the search pattern. The abandoned vessel groaned around her, metal contracting in the sub-zero temperatures. She found the second operative in the galley, methodically checking storage compartments. This one was smaller, faster, but Sarah had position. She disabled the lights at the circuit breaker, then used the ensuing confusion to close distance. Her Navy combat training took over. Strike, disarm, neutralize. The man went down hard. The radio chatter grew frantic. Someone outside was demanding updates that weren't coming. Sarah realized these weren't Volkov's only assets in play. This was just the first wave. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. Package confirmed. Extraction in 2 hours. Hold position. Admiral Crawford was mobilizing resources, but 2 hours might as well be 2 days if more hostiles arrived. Sarah made her way to the engine room, tapping the agreed pattern on the hatch. Metal scraped against metal as Maya unlocked it from inside. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was small in the darkness. "We're okay for now," Sarah said, gathering both children close. "But we need to move. There will be more coming." Maya studied her mother's face in the dim light. "This isn't about money laundering, is it?" Sarah met her daughter's gaze, seeing intelligence that reminded her painfully of David. "No, sweetheart. It's about something much bigger. Something that could prevent a war or start one, depending on who gets their hands on it." The wind outside intensified, rattling the ship's superstructure. Through the storm, Sarah caught the distant rumble of larger engines, helicopters, possibly aircraft. Volkov was escalating quickly, which meant he was desperate. She checked the crypto drives one more time, their weight both burden and salvation. The intelligence they contained could expose a network of corruption reaching into the highest levels of government, but only if they survived long enough to deliver it. "Listen carefully," she told the children. "We're going to leave the ship, but not the way we came. There's an emergency escape route through the torpedo room that leads to the shore. We'll have to move fast and stay quiet." Tommy nodded solemnly while Maya shouldered her pack with grim determination. Outside, the sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, competing with the storm's fury. Sarah Chen had spent years trying to leave her military past behind, but tonight she would need every skill that past had taught her. The encrypted radio crackled to life as Sarah finished uploading the final data packet to her secure server. Marcus's voice cut through the static, urgent and clipped. "Sarah, we've got movement on thermal. 3 vehicles approaching from the northeast, maybe 20 minutes out. And there's something else. Helicopter inbound from the south." Her blood ran cold. 20 minutes wasn't enough time to evacuate with the children, not in this storm. The wind still howled outside the warship's hull, and the snow showed no signs of letting up. Jake looked up from the crypto equipment he'd been helping her monitor. "What about all this?" "Leave it. The upload is complete." She began yanking hard drives from their connections, stuffing them into a waterproof bag. The original intelligence was safely transmitted, but these drives contained additional analysis that could prove crucial later, if they survived. Emma clutched her tablet, where she'd been tracking the money transfers. "Mom, I found something else in the accounts. There are payments going to someone called Lighthouse, always the same amount, always on the 15th of each month." Sarah paused mid-motion. Lighthouse. The code name triggered a memory from her Navy days. Whispers of a deep-cover operative who'd gone rogue, someone high enough in the intelligence community to have access to operations like the one that had killed David. "How much and for how long?" she asked, shouldering the bag. 50,000 every month for the past 3 years. "But Mom, the payments are coming from a DoD black budget account." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Lighthouse wasn't just connected to the conspiracy, they were being paid by the Department of Defense itself. This went deeper than corporate espionage or foreign interference. This was treason at the highest levels. Marcus's voice crackled again. "Vehicles are moving faster than expected. You've got maybe 15 minutes. We're heading to the engine room," Sarah transmitted back. "Can you create a distraction?" "Already on it. I've rigged some charges in the forward compartments. When they board, I'll give them something to think about." Sarah led Jake and Emma through the narrow corridors toward the ship's bowels. The engine room offered multiple escape routes and enough structural complexity to provide cover. More importantly, It connected to the ship's underwater access ports, a last resort, but one she'd identified during their initial reconnaissance. As they descended, Emma continued working on her tablet. "Mom, there's more. Lighthouse has been accessing classified shipping manifests, port authority databases, even Coast Guard patrol schedules. They're not just stealing technology, they're coordinating smuggling operations. David must have stumbled onto it," Jake said quietly. "That's why they killed him." Sarah nodded grimly. Her husband had always been thorough, probably too thorough for his own good. He would have connected the dots, just like Emma was doing now. The question was whether Lighthouse knew how much David had discovered before his death. They reached the engine room as the first explosion echoed through the ship. Marcus was making good on his promise to create chaos. Sarah positioned Jake and Emma behind a massive turbine housing and activated her radio. "Marcus, sit rep. They're aboard. Professional team, military gear. But here's the interesting part. They're not just searching, they're placing charges. I think they plan to scuttle the ship with us on it. Of course, sink the evidence along with the witnesses." Sarah's mind raced through the tactical situation. They couldn't stay aboard, but the storm made surface evacuation impossible. That left only one option. "Marcus, how long can you hold them?" 10 minutes, maybe 15 if I'm creative. That'll have to do. We're going underwater. Sarah, the water temperature. I know the risks." She turned to her children. "Remember those survival courses you hated? Time to put them to use." Emma's eyes went wide. "You want us to swim? In this weather?" "Not swim, dive. This ship has emergency escape pods in the lower compartments. They're designed for exactly this situation." Jake was already moving, following Sarah's lead toward a hatch marked with faded emergency symbols. "Will they work after all these years?" "We're about to find out." Another explosion, closer this time. Dust rained from the ceiling, and somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear voices shouting orders. Professional voices, coordinated and calm. Lighthouse's people weren't taking any chances. Sarah opened the hatch to reveal a cramped compartment containing 2 cylindrical pods, each barely large enough for 2 people. The equipment looked ancient but functional. Military engineering built to last. "Emma, you're with me. Jake, you take the second pod. Set your timer for 5 minutes after submersion, then surface near the ice shelf. Marcus will meet us there." "Mom," Emma whispered, "what if this doesn't work?" Sarah checked the pod's oxygen system, surprised to find it still functional. "Then we go down fighting. But your father didn't die for nothing, and neither will we. We're going to expose Lighthouse and everyone connected to this conspiracy." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Time was up. The submarine's engines hummed to life beneath Sarah's feet, a deep vibration that seemed to pulse through her bones. Captain Morrison's weathered hands moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency, while his skeleton crew of 3 prepared for what he grimly called the last dive of the beluga. "Surface radar shows Kozlov's ships converging from 2 directions," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years at sea. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they're in weapons range." "Mom, I can't find Emma anywhere." Jake's voice cracked with panic as he stumbled into the control room. Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean you can't find her? She was in the mess hall 5 minutes ago, but now—" The submarine lurched suddenly, throwing them against the bulkhead. Through the periscope monitor, Sarah could see the dark silhouette of Kozlov's yacht cutting through the choppy waters above them. "Emma!" Sarah's scream echoed through the narrow corridors as she pushed past Morrison's crew. The submarine was small, with limited hiding places, but Emma had always been clever at making herself invisible when frightened. She found her daughter wedged behind a stack of emergency equipment in the torpedo room, her small body trembling. "I heard the bad man's voice on the radio," Emma whispered. "He said he was going to hurt us." Sarah gathered Emma into her arms, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her chest. "Nobody's going to hurt you, baby, I promise." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew how fragile that promise was. Through the hull, she could hear the distinctive ping of active sonar. Kozlov's ships were hunting them. "Contact bearing 270. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. "Second vessel approaching from the north. They're trying to box us in." Sarah carried Emma back to the control room, where Jake stood white-faced beside the sonar station. The green screen showed two large blips closing in on their position, like predators circling wounded prey. "There's a thermal vent system about 2 miles northeast," Morrison said, studying the depth charts. "If we can reach it, the heat signature might mask our engines long enough to slip away." "And if we can't?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Morrison's grim expression said everything. The Beluga was an old research submarine, armed with nothing more dangerous than flare guns. Against Kozlov's military-grade weapons, they might as well be in a rowboat. The submarine dove deeper, angling toward the thermal vents. Through the hull, Sarah could hear the disturbing groan of metal under pressure. The Beluga had been designed for coastal research, not deep-water evasion tactics. "Torpedo in the water!" Morrison's sonar operator shouted. The next few seconds stretched into eternity. Sarah pulled both children close, feeling their small bodies pressed against hers as Morrison threw the submarine into a sharp turn. The torpedo's active seeker painted them with sound, a high-pitched whine that seemed to bore into Sarah's skull. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whining stopped. "Missed us by 50 meters, Morrison breathed. "They're firing blind. They know roughly where we are, but they can't get a clean lock." Sarah's relief was short-lived. On the sonar screen, she could see both enemy vessels moving into new positions, preparing for another attack. They had perhaps minutes before Kozlov's ships completed their encirclement. "There," Emma said suddenly, pointing at the depth chart with a small finger. "What's that squiggly line?" Sarah looked where her daughter was pointing and felt her pulse quicken. Hidden among the topographical markings was something she recognized from her Navy days, the outline of an underwater canyon system. "Morrison, can this boat handle the canyon run?" The captain followed her gaze, and his eyes widened. "That's a graveyard down there. Ships have been trying that passage for 50 years. The currents alone, but it's possible?" Morrison stared at the chart for a long moment, weighing their options against the sound of approaching engines above. "Possible, yes. Survivable. That's another question entirely." "Mom?" Jake's voice was small, uncertain. Sarah looked at her children, Jake trying so hard to be brave, Emma still clutching the small stuffed whale she'd found on the warship. They trusted her completely, just as they had when she'd led them into that blizzard 3 days ago. "We're going through the canyon," she told Morrison. The submarine's nose tilted downward, diving toward the black depths below. Behind them, Kozlov's ships followed, their sonar pinging frantically as their quarry disappeared into the treacherous underwater maze. In the darkness ahead lay either salvation or destruction. The blizzard had finally begun to weaken, but Sarah knew the relative calm was deceptive. Through the porthole, she could see figures moving across the ice field, dark shapes that shouldn't exist in this desolate wasteland. Victor's men had found them. "Mom, what's that sound?" Emma whispered, pressing closer to Sarah's side. The metallic groaning echoing through the ship's hull wasn't just the wind anymore. Marcus crouched beside the cache of documents they'd discovered, his young face etched with determination that reminded Sarah painfully of his father. "We can't let them get these, can we?" "No, we can't." Sarah began stuffing the most critical files into her jacket. The evidence of Kozlov's money laundering operation through military contracts was devastating. Bank transfers, coded communications, lists of compromised officials. It was enough to bring down his entire network, if they could get it to the right people. A sharp bang resonated from somewhere below, followed by voices speaking rapid Russian. Sarah's cryptographer training kicked in, analyzing the tactical situation. The ship had multiple entry points, but most were sealed by ice and years of neglect. They were coming through the cargo bay, the same route Sarah's family had used. "There's another way out," she said, remembering the ship's layout. "The bridge has an external ladder system. It'll be exposed to the wind, but—" The lights suddenly flickered and died. Emergency power hadn't functioned in years, leaving them in near-total darkness. Sarah heard Emma's sharp intake of breath and immediately reached for the flashlight, but stopped herself. Light would give away their position. "Stay close and stay quiet," she whispered, gathering her children. "Emma, hold my jacket. Marcus, take your sister's other hand. We move as one unit." They crept through the corridors Sarah had memorized during their time aboard. The ship creaked ominously around them, ice shifting in the changing weather. Behind them, the sounds of systematic searching grew closer, doors being forced, compartments cleared one by one. At the bridge access ladder, Sarah peered through the small window. The wind had died down enough to make climbing possible, but the metal rungs were coated with ice. One slip would mean a 30-foot fall onto frozen ground. "I'll go first," she whispered. "Test each step before you put your weight on it." As Sarah pushed open the hatch, frigid air slammed into them like a physical blow. The metal ladder was worse than she'd feared. Not just icy, but some of the rungs had corroded completely. They'd have to skip sections, making longer reaches between handholds. Emma whimpered as they began their descent. "I can't feel my fingers." "You can do this, sweetheart. Just like the climbing wall at school." Sarah kept her voice calm, though her own hands were rapidly going numb. Below them she could see more of Victor's men positioning themselves around the ship's perimeter. They were walking into a trap. Halfway down, Marcus's foot slipped. For a terrifying moment he dangled by one hand, his other arm flailing for purchase. Sarah lunged sideways, grabbing his jacket and hauling him back against the ladder. "I've got you," she breathed, her heart hammering. But the movement had been too visible. Shouts erupted from the ice field as flashlight beams swept toward them. "Run when we hit the ground," Sarah ordered. "The ice ridge to the north. We can use it for cover." The last 10 feet were a controlled fall more than a climb. They hit the frozen earth hard, Emma crying out despite her efforts to stay quiet. Sarah hauled both children to their feet, adrenaline overriding the pain in her ankles. Gunfire erupted behind them, automatic weapons chattering in the Arctic air. Ice chips exploded from the ship's hull as bullets struck metal. Sarah pushed her children ahead of her, using her body as a shield as they sprinted across the exposed ground. The ice ridge offered temporary shelter, but Sarah knew it wouldn't last long. Kozlov's men were professionals. They'd flank the position within minutes. She needed a new strategy, something they wouldn't expect. That's when she noticed the old radio equipment still visible in the ship's communications array. If any of it still functioned, if she could reach the Coast Guard frequency she'd memorized from her Navy days. "Stay here," she told the children, checking the documents were still secure in her jacket. "Whatever happens, don't move until I come back." "Mom, no." "Marcus, protect your sister. That's an order." Sarah met his eyes in the dim light. "I'm going to end this." She began working her way back toward the ship, using the storm's fading cover. Time was running out, but Sarah Chen had never backed down from impossible odds before. The emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the warship's bridge as Sarah's fingers flew over the communication console. She'd managed to patch into the ship's auxiliary power, giving her access to long-range radio capabilities that Kozlov's jamming equipment couldn't reach. The encrypted frequency she'd memorized years ago during her Navy service crackled to life. Static filled her earpiece for what felt like an eternity before a familiar voice responded. "Phoenix, this is Nightingale 7. We've been monitoring your situation. Help is en route." Relief flooded through Sarah, but it was short-lived. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the bridge, followed by the distinctive sound of weapons being readied. Kozlov's men had found her location. She quickly terminated the transmission and killed the lights, plunging the bridge into darkness. Through the frozen windows, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance where Marcus and Chen were holding their position near the stern. The gunfire had intensified, which meant Kozlov was pressing his attack from multiple angles. Sarah crawled beneath the navigation console just as the bridge door exploded inward. 3 armed figures swept into the room, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness like deadly fireflies. She held her breath, pressing herself against the cold metal as boots thundered past her hiding spot. "Bridge is clear," one of them reported into his radio. No sign of the woman. They moved toward the communications array, and Sarah realized with growing dread that they were looking for evidence of outside contact. If they discovered her transmission, they'd know help was coming and might accelerate their timeline. One of the men stopped directly above her position. She could see his boots through the gaps in the console housing, close enough that she could hear his breathing. Her hand instinctively moved to the knife Marcus had given her, though she knew that against 3 armed professionals, stealth was her only advantage. A new sound reached her ears, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm, but instead of hope, it filled her with terror. Kozlov wouldn't have called for air support unless he planned to eliminate all witnesses and extract the stolen intelligence immediately. The men on the bridge heard it too. "Transport's early," one muttered. "Boss wants the package secured in 10 minutes. They turned to leave, but the leader paused at the doorway. "Wait, check that console again. Something's not right." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached her hiding spot. She gripped the knife handle, knowing that if discovered, she'd have only one chance to fight her way out. The tactical light beam swept closer, illuminating the cramped space where she'd wedged herself. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the ship so violently that all 3 men were thrown off their feet. Emergency alarms began wailing throughout the vessel, and Sarah heard Marcus's voice shouting orders somewhere in the distance. In the chaos, she slipped out from under the console and made her way to the shattered bridge windows. Below on the ice, she could see the helicopter touching down, its rotors creating a whirlwind of snow and debris. But there was something wrong with the scene. Instead of Kozlov's men securing a perimeter, she watched as armed figures poured from the aircraft and immediately engaged his forces. Her radio transmission had worked. The cavalry had arrived. The 3 men on the bridge were scrambling to re-establish communication with their unit, shouting conflicting reports into their radios. Sarah used their confusion to slip past them and back into the corridor. She had to reach Emma and Jake before the firefight escalated further. Racing through the ship's narrow passages, she could hear the battle raging both inside and outside the vessel. Kozlov's voice echoed from somewhere below, barking orders in Russian. His careful plan clearly falling apart, but Sarah knew that cornered predators were often the most dangerous. She found Emma and Jake huddled in the engine room where she'd left them, exactly as instructed. Emma's eyes were wide with terror, but she was holding her younger brother protectively, demonstrating a courage that made Sarah's chest swell with pride. "Mommy," Jake whispered as she gathered them both in her arms. The loud noises, "I know, baby. But the good guys are here now. We just need to stay hidden a little longer." Emma looked up at her with those 2 wise eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" Before Sarah could answer, the engine room door burst open. But instead of Kozlov or his men, Marcus stumbled inside, his tactical vest torn and bloodied. "Sarah, thank God you're all safe. We need to move now. Kozlov's making a run for the intelligence cache, and if he reaches it before backup secures the area..." He didn't need to finish. Sarah understood that their nightmare would only end when Kozlov was captured or dead, and the stolen secrets were back in the right hands. The sound of approaching rotors cut through the howling wind like a mechanical heartbeat, growing stronger with each passing second. Sarah pressed herself against the bulkhead, peering through the small porthole at the whitewashed landscape beyond. 3 black helicopters materialized through the snow, their searchlights carving bright circles across the abandoned naval yard. Not yet, they haven't. Sarah pulled her daughter back from the window, her mind racing through their options. The warship's maze of corridors and compartments had served them well so far, but Kozlov's men would be systematic, professional. They'd seal every exit and work their way through deck by deck until they found what they were looking for. Marcus clutched the hard drive containing the decrypted files, his knuckles white against the black plastic casing. "What's the plan?" Sarah checked her weapon. 4 rounds left in the magazine, 1 spare clip. Not enough for a prolonged firefight, especially against a well-armed tactical team. But she hadn't survived this long by playing their game. "We're going to give them exactly what they want," she said, ejecting the magazine and checking the rounds again. "Or at least make them think we are." The first rope dropped from the lead helicopter, followed by the distinctive silhouette of a soldier fast roping down. Sarah counted 6 figures descending before the aircraft pulled away to provide overwatch. More ropes from the second helicopter. They were surrounding the ship. She led Emma and Marcus deeper into the vessel's interior, following a route she'd memorized during their days of hiding. The ship's original blueprints, still posted in the damage control station, had shown her something Kozlov's men wouldn't know about: a secondary ammunition lift that connected the forward magazine to the main deck. More importantly, it had an auxiliary shaft that led to the old torpedo loading bay. "Stay close and stay quiet," she whispered, guiding them through a hatch marked with radiation warnings. The symbols were meaningless now. This section had been decontaminated decades ago, but they might buy precious seconds of hesitation from their pursuers. The sound of boots on metal echoed from somewhere behind them, multiple sets, moving with tactical precision. Sarah could hear muffled radio chatter, the kind of professional communication that meant these weren't street thugs or desperate criminals. These were soldiers, probably former Spetsnaz or similar special operations background. They reached the ammunition lift shaft, and Sarah pried open the manual override panel. The ancient machinery groaned to life, motors struggling against years of corrosion and cold. Too loud. Their position would be compromised within minutes. "Marcus, I need you to listen carefully." She kept her voice steady, professional, the same tone she'd used during crisis situations in her Navy days. "When we reach the torpedo bay, there's going to be a maintenance tunnel that leads to the dry dock drainage system. You take Emma and follow that tunnel to the harbor. There's a small boat tied up at the civilian marina, blue hull with white trim. Keys are under the stern seat. What about you? Someone needs to slow them down." She handed him her spare magazine. "You remember what I taught you about the safety?" Marcus nodded, though his hands shook as he took the ammunition. "I'm not leaving you here. You're not leaving me. You're protecting your sister." Sarah looked at Emma, seeing her own determination reflected in the girl's eyes. "And you're protecting something bigger than all of us. Those files contain enough evidence to bring down an entire network of arms dealers and corrupt officials. They can't be allowed to disappear." The lift shuddered to a halt, and Sarah forced open the gate. The torpedo bay spread out before them, a cavernous space lined with empty weapon racks and loading equipment. Patches of ice reflected their flashlight beams like broken mirrors. Footsteps echoed from the shaft above. Close now. Sarah found the maintenance tunnel and helped Emma squeeze through the narrow opening. Marcus followed, pausing to look back at her one last time. "The boat's name is Elena," she said. "Tell the harbour master you're with the Chen party. He'll help you get to the Coast Guard station." A voice echoed from somewhere in the ship's upper levels, speaking Russian. She caught fragments, orders to secure the exits, to take prisoners if possible, but not at the expense of the mission. Kozlov wanted them alive, but his patience had limits. Sarah sealed the maintenance tunnel behind her children and moved to the bay's main entrance. She had perhaps 3 minutes before the tactical team reached this level. 3 minutes to set up an ambush that would give Marcus and Emma enough time to reach safety. She thought about the encrypted files, about the web of corruption and violence they represented. Her husband had died because of what those files contained. But his death would mean something if the truth finally came to light. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft click of tactical equipment and whispered commands. Sarah checked her weapon one final time and settled into position behind a torpedo rack. It was time to finish this. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the frozen harbor like a predator's eye, its beam cutting through the swirling snow. Sarah pressed herself against the bulkhead, heart hammering, as she watched the light dance across the water just 50 yards from their position. Emma whimpered beside her, and Sarah pulled her daughter closer, covering the girl's mouth gently with her hand. "They can't see us," she whispered into Emma's ear. "The storm's too thick." But even as she said it, Sarah knew their advantage was slipping away. The blizzard that had been their salvation was weakening, and dawn would break in less than an hour. Once the sun rose and the snow cleared, they'd be sitting ducks on this exposed warship. 5 minutes they might not have. Through the porthole, Sarah could see the helicopter settling into a hover pattern, methodically searching the harbor. 2 more aircraft had joined the hunt, their rotors creating a mechanical symphony of death that echoed off the surrounding cliffs. Tommy sat hunched over the cipher machine, still working feverishly despite everything. The boy had surprised her with his determination. While she and Marcus had been planning their escape, Tommy had been quietly decoding the remaining files they'd pulled from Kozlov's servers. "Mom," he said suddenly, his voice tight with excitement, "you need to see this." Sarah crawled over to him, keeping low. The screen displayed a series of decoded messages, timestamps showing they'd been sent just hours ago. As she read, her blood turned colder than the Arctic air seeping through the hull. Asset confirmation received. Package location verified aboard USS Leviathan. Cleanup protocol authorized for all witnesses. The next message made her stomach drop. Thermal imaging confirms 4 heat signatures aboard target vessel. Prepare for breach and recovery. They know exactly where we are, she breathed. They've been tracking our body heat. Marcus looked up from the radio, his face grim. That's impossible. This hull is too thick for standard thermal. His words were cut off by a sharp metallic clang from somewhere above them. Then another, and another. They're landing on the deck, Sarah said, her training kicking in automatically. She began running scenarios, calculating angles and distances, multiple insertion points. They'll breach from the stern and bow simultaneously. Emma started to cry, but Sarah couldn't comfort her now. Every second counted. "The money," Marcus said. "We could trade it for safe passage." "No." Sarah was already moving, grabbing the waterproof cases containing the most damaging evidence. "The cash is just a bonus to them. It's what we know that makes us dangerous." Tommy slammed his laptop shut. "I've copied everything to the drives. All of it. The money transfers, the weapons deals, the government contracts. Everything." The clanging above intensified, joined now by the whine of cutting tools. Sparks began raining down from the ceiling as acetylene torches bit into the steel. "Service tunnel," Sarah said, pointing toward a maintenance hatch she'd spotted earlier. "It leads to the engine room. From there we can reach the lower cargo hold." "And then what?" Marcus demanded. "We're trapped on this ship." Sarah smiled grimly, her mind already 3 steps ahead. "No, we're not. Tommy, how long would it take you to upload those files to every news outlet and government watchdog in North America?" "Good." She turned to Marcus. "You said you could reach the Coast Guard?" "Eventually, yes." "Then we're not running anymore." Sarah checked her weapon, chambering around. "We're going to make so much noise that half the world will be watching when Kozlov's people try to silence us." The cutting sounds stopped abruptly. In the sudden quiet, Sarah could hear voices shouting commands, boots moving across the deck with military precision. "Move," she whispered. They crawled toward the service hatch as the first breach charges exploded above them. The warship shuddered, and emergency lighting flickered to life throughout the compartment. Sarah twisted the heavy wheel on the hatch, her muscles straining against decades of corrosion. Behind them, tactical lights began strobing through the smoke-filled bridge. Voices echoed in the passageways, professional, calm, deadly. "Contact in 30 seconds, someone called out in accented English." The hatch finally gave way, and Sarah pushed her children through into the narrow tunnel beyond. Marcus followed, clutching his radio equipment. As she pulled the hatch shut behind them, Sarah could hear their pursuers spreading through the ship like a virus. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something other than fear. She felt like a Navy cryptographer again. And She was ready to fight back. The helicopter circled the USS Defiance one final time before disappearing into the grey dawn sky, carrying Marcus Volkov and his surviving men away from the frozen graveyard that had claimed so many lives. Sarah watched from the bridge until it became a speck against the clouds, then finally allowed herself to breathe. "Are they really gone?" Emma whispered, still pressed against her mother's side. "They're gone, sweetheart." Sarah's voice was hoarse from exhaustion, but steady. "It's over." Jake emerged from behind the navigation console where he'd taken cover during the final standoff. His face was pale but determined. "What happens now? With all that money?" Sarah looked back at the sealed hatch leading to the lower decks, where millions in laundered cryptocurrency codes lay hidden in the ship's bowels. The fortune that had cost so many lives, that had brought death to this frozen vessel twice over, first in wartime, and now again in the digital age. "Now we do the right thing," she said, pulling out the satellite phone Commander Torres had left behind. "We call it in properly this time." The rescue came 12 hours later, Coast Guard helicopters, and an icebreaker that carved through the frozen bay like a knife through paper. Sarah stood on the deck with her children, watching the orange-suited figures rappel down to them, and felt a strange sadness at leaving the old warship behind. "Ma'am, I'm Chief Petty Officer Martinez," the lead rescuer said, his face professional but kind behind his visor. "We're here to get you home." As they lifted off, Sarah looked down at the Defiance one last time. From the air, it looked smaller somehow, less threatening. Just an old ship locked in ice, keeping its secrets for whatever came next. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, watching rain streak the windows. The debriefing sessions were finally over, the statements given, the reports filed. The FBI had recovered the cryptocurrency codes and traced them back through a web of shell companies and criminal enterprises that stretched across 3 continents. Volkov's network was crumbling. "Mom?" Emma slid into the booth across from her, followed by Jake. They'd been shopping for winter clothes. Their old ones had been lost in evidence processing. "How'd it go?" Sarah asked, though she could tell from their faces they'd had fun. It was good to see them smile again. "Jake tried on like 50 jackets, Emma said, grinning. "I did not, maybe 10. Jake's protest was half-hearted. "Mom, there's something on the news about the ship." Sarah looked up at the coffee shop's television, where a reporter stood in front of a government building. The chyron read, "World War II vessel becomes historic site. The USS Defiance will be preserved as a memorial to the sailors who served aboard her during World War II, the reporter was saying. The Coast Guard announced today that the vessel will be carefully extracted from the ice and towed to Seattle, where it will become part of the Naval Museum complex. Sarah smiled. The old ship would get the respect it deserved. Her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Torres. "Heard about the museum. Thought you'd want to know. They're planning a ceremony. You and the kids would be welcome as guests of honor." Sarah showed the message to Emma and Jake. "What do you think? Want to see the Defiance one more time when she's somewhere warmer? Will there be food?" Jake asked. "Definitely food." "Then yes." Emma was quieter, thoughtful. "Do you think the sailors who died there would be happy about it becoming a memorial?" Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought about the frozen bodies they'd found, the men who'd served and died so far from home. "I think they'd be proud that people will remember them, that their service mattered." Outside, the Seattle rain continued its steady rhythm. Sarah's phone rang, a number she recognized as the FBI field office. "Sarah Chen." "Miss Chen, this is Agent Morrison. I wanted to give you an update. We've made arrests in 7 countries based on the intelligence you helped us recover. The network is essentially defunct. And Volkov? Cooperating fully. He's looking at life without parole, but his information is helping us roll up similar operations worldwide." When she hung up, both kids were watching her expectantly. "It's really over?" Emma asked. "It's really over." Jake grinned and stole a sip of her coffee. "So what do we do now?" Sarah looked at her children, A brave, resilient children who'd survived something that would have broken many adults. They were scarred, but not shattered, changed, but not broken. Now, she reached across the table and took both their hands. Now we go home and live our lives, real lives, quiet lives. Boring lives? Jake asked hopefully. Sarah laughed, the sound bright and free. The most boring lives you can imagine. Outside, the rain began to ease, and pale sunlight filtered through the breaking clouds.